Hello there, I'm Suze, and welcome to Tea. This is an introductory course for anybody who is interested to learn more about tea, whether that's professionally, as well as for anybody who is signed up for my online membership program and is looking for a good place to start when you may be very new to tea and are still learning to talk a little bit of the language, not quite sure how to brew the tea. So this gives us a nice little grounding place that we can get started together. And I also want to explain a little bit more about the program that I offer online, share a little bit about the setup that we're doing, the type of platform we're using, what members typically learn in the program, and also talk a little bit about my teaching style and the point of view that I'm coming from in creating the types of workshops that I do. So I have a company called Being Tea, and I work with other companies and businesses primarily who interact with tea in some way. And that could be very, very broad. Sometimes it's coffee roasters who want to start a tea program and they need staff training, or it's tea companies who need help with their menu development, sourcing, descriptions, training, things like that. So I work on a really, really large range of projects, but they all focus and center around education and training as a major component of that. Because to me, the crossroads for everything in tea comes through education. It's not just simply about 101 type courses, but it's about how everything interacts with that. The more knowledge that we have about tea, the more creative things we can do with it, and the better we can be in our professional jobs if we work with tea, as well as in our lives as tea drinkers and tea lovers. So I'm really passionate about education. It's what I've done in tea for 15 years now. And I started Being Tea about 3 years ago, primarily working one-on-one with businesses. But this past year, I started also offering courses online. And so that's what you're seeing as part of this, is being able to teach to anybody in whatever time zone they're at and being able to offer interactive classes. Primarily, these classes are live. So recordings are available for everything if you miss a session. And such as this class, you can replay it and you can share it with others and all that good stuff. But I really love teaching in a live environment. That's actually my background prior to working in tea, was working in live television as a news producer. For me, the unpredictability of what could happen live is pretty fun, but also just the energy that's involved with interacting with people in real time is really great. So when you take a live class in the platform we're using, which is called Crowdcast, you may notice at the bottom of the screen there, there's options for people to ask questions and participate in polls. There's a little chat window off to the side there that you can engage with other attendees. So it's very interactive. And there's also an ability that if you have a setup at home where you have a webcam and stuff like that, during a class, if you need some help with something, say it's a matcha class and we're learning how to whisk the tea, and that's really hard for people to do at first. If you want some guidance on your technique, you can show me. You could just send a message and I can pop your camera up on screen and we can do that side by side. It also allows us to do interviews and things like that. So it's a very, very cool platform that I particularly really love. It's one of the reasons why I don't do pre-recorded videos very often. I get a lot of questions about that because I know that people really like being able to browse the library and just learn in very separate blocks, very task-oriented like that. But when I was talking earlier about my teaching style, that's not really me. So with the Being Tea program, we focus very largely on functional skills. So I don't really teach like in a strict academic structure where there's different tiers to get through and, quizzes and exams to take and certificates at the end. I don't do that. There's a lot of that out in the tea world and some of it is really great. But for me, it's about the everyday interaction with tea. It's being able to apply that knowledge to all the teas that you interact with and learning how to brew them and work with them more intuitively and how to just really genuinely enjoy tea on a day-to-day, season-by-season basis so that it's a part of your life. And that applies to whether you work with it professionally or you're just a tea enthusiast. So I focus on functional knowledge, what you can actually tangibly take with you and execute and do something with. And for that reason, that's why I really enjoy doing live videos, or at least classes that are more built out with different dynamic components to them. So that it's not just very specific on one type of thing without context for how that may interact with other teas and other categories and other aspects of the tea world. So in this particular class, what we're going to do is some presentation, a little bit of background about tea and where it comes from, and most importantly, how to prepare some tea, because I see that is a really big point that is often lacking in 101 type classes. Everybody should be able to walk away knowing how to brew tea. At any time, you should be learning how to make tea. And one of the wonderful things about tea is that really there are no hard and fast rules about a lot of things. So if you're in a class with me and you ask me a question, a lot of times the answer may be, it depends. And that's okay. Still ask the question, because it's good to know what things that work within that boundary of the answer. It depends, you know. But there are no rules. It's about understanding sort of where the walls vaguely are and being able to come up against that and understand through taste and through smell what works for you and what doesn't. So being able to brew tea is such an important skill set. It's one that a lot of classes focus on at some part of their component. So for the classes, I always send out a list of suggested equipment and suggested teas from whatever you may have at home that you may wish to get so that you could brew along with me during the class. So this particular class, we're going to taste 4 different teas to get a range of what one might encounter in the tea world. And we're going to talk a little bit about the vocabulary and how these teas are made. But largely, we're going to start with this presentation a little bit about where tea comes from and just sort of an overview of what we're looking at here. So let me go ahead and put this up here for you. Great. So you should be able to see the welcome slide here for the first part of our presentation. I call this course Welcome to Tea. So getting started, what is tea? That can sound sort of like a lofty question, right? I always start beginners classes by asking this because the answers that I hear are really intriguing and they can kind of be all over the place. For some people, it's a very specific type of tea. Maybe some people say Belgian oolong or first flush Darjeeling or silver needle. That's their type of tea that they drink. Other people are a little bit more traditionalist, maybe Earl Grey or an English breakfast. And oftentimes I get answers that are very brand specific. So maybe sleepy time tea or something like that. There's this kind of blending that happens in tea because of the naming functions of different types of tea, where it could be very easy at first to not know if you're talking about something that's a type, that's a branded product, or that is the traditional name of that tea. So for example, the one that you see at the bottom here on the far left side, that's Silver Needle. So that's a white tea. Now, Silver Needle is a very lovely, poetic sounding name, and that could just as easily be a company's branded name as it could be this tea, right? The one to the right of that, that is Sencha. So that is a Japanese green tea, and that's a very common type of tea. There are many types of Sencha. There's really only one type of Silver Needle. Some teas are named by where they come from. So the top 2 in the middle there, those are Assam and Darjeeling. Those are areas in India. So there are many answers for the question, what is tea? And some people also throw out things like ginger and peppermint and so on. So it's worth exploring how we answer this question a little bit more clearly. So for the purposes of our class, tea is a beverage that is made from the harvested leaves of a specific plant. And that plant's name is Camellia sinensis. So this includes black tea and green tea, such as you see in the photo here, and other types of tea. And Camellia sinensis is also affectionately called the tea plant. So you'll hear us reference it that way in classes as well. We'll just say the tea plant. Camellia sinensis is a plant that naturally wants to grow into a tree. And we'll take some photos, take a look at some photos later of tea gardens. But they shape it and prune it so that it's about a bush height. So you'll also hear people refer to it as the tea bush. Here's an up-close shot of what the plant itself looks like. And when we're picking the leaves for the harvest to be able to make tea, this is what some of those leaves look like up close. Now there are, generally speaking, 6 categories of tea. So there's 6 families that we can put all these different types of tea that you see in the marketplace, online or on shelves. We can organize them in this way. So they are green tea, yellow, white, oolong, black, and dark tea. And we'll talk about some of those differences between a few of these types today as we're tasting them. And in future classes, we dive a little bit deeper into each one of these. But these 6 types all come from the Camellia sinensis plant. They're actually all made from the same harvested leaves of that plant. Now, there are different varieties of the tea plant, just as there are different varieties of apples, for example. And some apples are better for eating and others are really best if you bake them, right? So there's different recommendations for what to do for different types of apples. And that same thing is very true of Camellia sinensis. There are different varieties of Camellia sinensis, and some are really only used to make green tea because that's just what the taste is preferred for. There are some that are only used to make oolong tea. So you will find this level of specialization, and in some literature and in some schools, you'll also hear people step back from this generalized statement of saying that all tea comes from Camellia sinensis by being more specific about which varieties the different types come from. But it's definitely fair to say, for a very basic understanding, that it's this plant that is mainly what we're working with here for making these types of tea. Now, other beverages may also be called tea. And technically this is incorrect, but I would, as a teacher, I would never lecture anybody that by saying peppermint tea or chamomile tea that you are wrong. But it's worth noting that other things are using this same term. So these are herbal teas. So and this includes like rooibos, or sometimes people call it red tea, yerba mate, ginger, hibiscus, all sorts of things. So herbal teas are basically just made from any other plant that is not Camellia sinensis. This is essentially any roots, bark, seeds, fruit, herbs, nuts, flowers that you infuse in the water and you drink the water. And that's an herbal tea. In some places, actually, this term is not used interchangeably with Camellia sinensis tea. There are other words that are used for it. Unfortunately, in North America, we use it interchangeably. So it does cause some confusion. So for the purposes of this class, when we're talking about tea, we are specifically talking about from Camellia sinensis. And actually, the classes that I teach in general focus on that. Herbals are a big part of professionally what I work with because it's such a huge part of the marketplace. But my research and my own study is specific to Camellia sinensis. So I don't really host classes that have herbal teas as a prominent component of them, just in case anybody's wondering. So tea often grows in just really ridiculously beautiful places like this. The scenery of a tea garden is what you're looking at here. This is in Taiwan. And the pale green is the newest growth. And this is what will be harvested for making tea. So when the tea plant is putting forth new leaves, they're very, very pale green at first, and that makes them easy to spot when you are picking them. Another view between the rows here. So in a typical tea garden, the plants are planted in rows and pruned to be about waist high. And leaves for the finest teas are harvested entirely by hand. Now, machine harvesting is used in quite a few parts of the world, but broadly speaking, the finest teas, the ones that command the highest value on the market, are the ones that are harvested by hand. Now, these tea plants, the bushes, are productive mainly for their first 50 years, but there are definitely some that are significantly older, in fact, hundreds of years. The oldest tea plants that are known to still be on Earth, located in far southern China in Yunnan province, some of those are over 1,500 years old. So at that point, we're talking more about forest style tea production. And you'll hear about this a lot when you're looking into different types of teas, forest teas, or sometimes people call them wild or semi-wild. There's really not an agreement on specifically how you can use that term, But it basically just means forest grown tea, where it's its natural habitat. It wasn't, planted onto a farm like this where the plants are in rows, but they just grow into trees. They're just like an orchard almost. And some of the trunks of these plants are just enormous when they're so old. Now, the older they get, they don't produce as much new leaf as frequently. And that's part of the reason why when you get tea from old growth, is a term you'll see a lot. When you get tea from old growth areas, it tends to be very expensive because the plant doesn't produce as much at that point. So most of the tea that you're seeing in the commercial market is from plants like this, and they're somewhere around 50 or a little bit older. You can't start harvesting from them when they're quite young, usually like 5 years or so. So it has a long range of being able to be active in producing new tea. Now, this is what we're specifically picking. So this is what we call 2 leaves in a bud for most teas. You will find some teas that are made only with the leaf bud. And so when we say leaf bud, we're referring to an unopened new leaf, not like a flower bud. And so at that time, that little leaf bud, from when it first sprouted as a little node and grew into that larger shape, it's usually only about like 7 to 10 days old. So it's not a very old leaf. It's very young. And then just below that is the first leaf, and then we have the second leaf. And then just below that is where we pick it. We pinch the shoot right there to get 2 leaves in a bud. So many, many types of teas are made from this. You see green teas and black teas, white teas that are made from this same little plucking of the leaf. Now see that really big one there? So that's the third leaf down. Third and fourth leaf is often used for making oolong tea. So if you get really into oolong teas, you'll notice as those leaves unfurl, they can be quite large. And part of that can be due from it's using the older leaf, because oolong requires a lot of intensive rolling and shaping in its crafting. So you need something that's a little bit tougher and a little bit larger. But primarily, at least for especially some very fine green teas, we're working with just the leaf bud in the first leaf and then also the second leaf there. So all tea starts out as raw leaf, and it's harvested by hand or by machine from the plant. And like I noted before, there are some plants that are favored for certain types of tea than others. But in theory, just to put it out there, you could, from your little plot of land, make any type of tea from those same plants. So this photo is from June Chiabari Tea Garden. They're located in Nepal. And June Chiabari produces an enormous range of tea, all from those same plants. They may have different sections of the garden that they favor and different varieties of their plants that they favor for certain types, but they produce early spring green tea, later spring and early summer green tea, which does taste very different. They produce white teas, black teas, semi-oxidized teas. They're oolong-like, an enormous range, and it's all from their garden. So that's the key difference between those 6 types of tea that we talked about, is really coming down to what is done to these harvested leaves after you pick them. And this is called tea production. Now, there are an enormous range of steps in tea production that's far too intensive to get into for this class, but we can basically explain it as the transformation of raw, fresh leaf into finished tea. So specialized techniques such as rolling and roasting, oxidation, steaming, firing, aging, etc., are used to create a recipe, basically you could think of it as that way, for each tea, and one that is uniquely adapted by each tea maker. So there is a format for how white tea is made. There is a basic format for how oolong tea is made. And everywhere you go, that is adapted by the tea maker to their style and to their tradition of what they prefer to make. The basic steps of tea production, though, as far as just physically what's happening, is any combination of these steps. So first, withering, which is to help that leaf get soft. You know, when it's on the bush, it's pretty crisp, it's full of water. If you tried rolling it and shaping it or anything, it would just shatter and break apart. So when you wilt it and wither it, it gets soft. And so that allows it to be more pliable and ready for other stages, such as rolling, which is where we bruise that leaf and we help break open some of the cell walls. Oxidation is what helps develop color and aroma. And that's primarily one of the biggest differences between the types of tea, is how oxidized they are. In other words, how reddish brown, some have gotten over others. Oxidation is really critical because it develops color and aroma. Firing, which is using dry heat to remove any of the remaining moisture. And then finally grading, which is how we sort the leaves into consistent size. So they're put through a series of screens, and that's how when you look at most of your teas, there are quite a few that are very uniform in size. Now, some are not, and that's very purposeful, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to our tasting. A little up-close view of oxidation. So what we mean by this term, so we have these green leaves on the left here. These are less oxidized. You can see there's just a little bit of some darkness around the stem or lower on the leaf versus this black tea on the right. This is more fully oxidized. See how it's reddish and it's brown. That one larger one there sort of looks like it has a little bit of like an olive greenish tone to it, but overall it's a lot more oxidized. So this factor, oxidation, is a real key point in how tea is classified. Fully oxidized teas are considered black teas. Green teas are considered, for the most part, unoxidized. Oolong and yellow and white tea are just everything in between. And that's, again, a very simplified way of viewing it. And yes, there are specific steps for just white tea and just yellow tea. But at its basic, you should just understand it chemically. We're looking at how deeply it's oxidized. And that directly affects the flavor. And we'll get to that in our tasting. So just a little side note here, if you're looking at some of the teas in your cabinet and you're like, well, yeah, but mine has a lot of other stuff in it. So what's all this? So this, for example, is a blend that I worked on for a client of mine that includes the ingredients listed there: roasted green tea that's blended with jasmine green tea, peppermint, spices, sunflower, and safflower petals. So it's worth noting that many teas in the marketplace are also blended or flavored to create unique recipes and maintain product consistency. So most of my classes I'm teaching are dealing specifically with unblended teas. It's just the straight tea. As far as not as a way of excluding the importance of blended and flavored teas in the marketplace, but it's, again, since I focus so much on the functional, I like starting with the building blocks. So you can create a great blend if you understand the building blocks of those blends by knowing tea flavor and knowing different types of tea flavor and how to describe it. And that's a really great way to get into blending, because blending is hugely creative and really fun. So blending is basically when you're mixing in other ingredients, such as spices, flowers, fruit, and herbs, as well as other teas, such as this one. This is a blend of 2 different teas in addition to other ingredients. Flavoring is a different step. It's to apply an oil, which could be natural or synthetic, to teas and blends that enhance or change their flavor. So the most famous example of this is Earl Grey. A lot of people may not realize that Earl Grey is actually a flavored tea. It is flavored using oil from the bergamot orange, which is sort of this bright, lemony, bitter, very fragrant fruit that is native to Italy. And so that lemony, fresh, zesty flavor that you get, that is from bergamot oil that is applied to that tea. So Earl Grey is a flavored tea. So if you're ever not sure if your tea is a blend or a flavored tea, just read the ingredients, because blended teas and flavored teas will list out all these different elements in them. So now let's get to the brewing of tea. A little bit of a working knowledge of where tea is coming from and how it's made. Now let's talk about how we prepare it, because this can actually be one of the most intimidating steps of working with tea. And also for people when they're picking up new teas, you just, something looks interesting online and you get it home and you have no idea how to start making that tea. So let's hopefully alleviate some of that. Tea brewing is about knowing what I call your 3 T's: the amount of tea, the time range, and the temperature of the water. So these are the 3 basic variables that you need to know in order to brew a tea. Now, some of these remain pretty constant. Others have a pretty consistent range. So there's definitely a starting point, and that's what we're trying to get at here. The guide points that I'm going to share with you are just that. They're just guide points. That's somewhere to give you a start. So if you wanted to pick up, say, some spring green tea that just came in over on the harvest this year in China from one of your favorite producers, you at least have an idea of, okay, well, I will try this because I know that this is what works for my other green teas. And you can adjust it from there. So first, let's talk about the amount of tea. This is probably one of the most common dropping off points for tea, at least that I see in the food service market when I'm working with people in cafes and in restaurants. We really oversimplify the measuring of tea as far as just assuming that, oh, well, it's just a scoop or it's just a tea bag and you can put however much water you want on it. If you're a coffee drinker, you are aware of this point. There's different amounts of coffee that are needed for different sizes of a coffee drink, right? So the same is very true with tea. If you're trying to make 24 ounces of tea, you certainly cannot use the same amount that you would for a cup of tea. You need more leaf. Now, because teas come in all shapes, sizes, and densities, it is worth noting that weight is far more accurate than doing this by volume. Most tea packages that you will get have a volume metric measurement on them. So they'll say like use 1 teaspoon or use 2 teaspoons. That's not a fault against the tea company. It's more speaking to the still very common practice in the marketplace that most consumers are not working with a scale for their tea brewing. That may eventually change though, because the popularity of specialty coffee brewing at home and the awareness of standards for how specialty coffee is brewed require an awareness and a comfortability of working with weight. You know, baristas know that for this type of coffee, it's this number of grams for making an espresso versus this number of grams for making a Chemex pot. We're very, very comfortable with that by now. It didn't always used to be the case, but it has certainly gravitated towards that. And because tea so closely mirrors and works with coffee in very close proximity in the marketplace, I do feel that eventually tea will gravitate to that point where we're more comfortable talking about measuring something in grams. It's really not that difficult. It just requires getting a little small gram scale, costs you $10 on Amazon, super easy. It will dramatically improve the consistency of your brewing if you're aware of how much tea you're putting in. Over time, you do start to get more comfortable with visually what it looks like and how much you're putting in. And you know, you can go back to using a scoop if you like, or just sort of taking a little 3-finger pinch of leaf and putting it in a pot. But at least knowing what it looks like, because since tea is visually, all these types are so different from each other, it's very hard to gauge otherwise. So as one example, by weight, an average small serving of tea, so like an 8 to 12 ounce, something around 350 milliliters, that would probably be about 3 to 5 grams of tea. Now, if you're doing this by volume, that's about a level tablespoon. I definitely recommend folks using a tablespoon versus a teaspoon, and I'll show you a little bit the difference when we get back on screen here for brewing. But a tablespoon will allow you to scoop the leaf better than a very narrow teaspoon. So just be aware of that. The ratio that we're working here, as far as if you want to scale this up or down to different sizes, is most tea likes to be somewhere around 1.5 grams or 2 grams per 100 milliliters of water. So that's about 3 ounces. Now, a tablespoon of tea on average for an 8-ounce cup is going to be somewhere around that 3 to 5 gram mark. So that's how we scale that up. So let's say if you have a teapot that is like that 8 to 12, then what do you do if you have a 16-ounce pot that is, you know, tea for 2? Well, you probably want somewhere that's like 7 or 8 grams, right? So you don't necessarily need to double it, but you know, taste it to make sure. If you can get down to that ratio of 1.5 grams to 2 grams per 100 milliliters, that will help guide how much tea that you're putting in there. A little visual representation of why weight matters. So this is 4 grams, an average cup size for 4 very different teas. And this is what they look like, both just as a scoop on their own, as well as in one of those little paper filter bags that you can use to take tea to go. I mean, look at that black tea. It barely even fits in the bag. So it can be very easy to generalize your tea brewing if you're not paying close attention to the shapes and densities of different tea. Let's talk about temperature and time. So water temp and steep time really go hand in hand. They are relational to each other. So if the temperature of your water is hotter than ideally you'd like to be working with, the time should be decreased because hotter water is going to extract a lot more quickly. If the temperature is cooler than you would like, that's okay. Just brew for a longer period of time. Tea is definitely quite flexible. Some general guidelines though. So for your steamed green teas, mainly your Japanese teas, you're going to want around 150 to 165 or about 60 C. And again, you can tailor that as you need. The steamed green teas tend to extract a lot more quickly in water. And so they don't really need a super high temperature. Pan-fired greens, however, such as like classical Chinese greens, can definitely take a hotter temp. So 165, 180, so somewhere around like 70, 75 C. White and oolong, a little bit hotter, 180, 195, somewhere around 80 to 90. And black and pu'er teas. So these are getting to the hotter. So 195, 210. Probably want to top those at about 92 C. You're not really looking to boil the water here. There's a long standing belief of putting fully rolling boiling water on black tea and pu'er. And you certainly can if you want really, really strong flavor like that, but you definitely don't need to. Step the water back just a little bit and you're going to get more of the aromatic nuance out of those teas. You're going to get more softness out of them. Now, again, these are all guidelines. Truth be told, honestly, the only thing is more temperature sensitive are green teas. So for a cafe, for example, that may not have the ability to really get granular with the water here, that's okay. You could just use the same hot water that is coming off of your coffee brewer that's near boiling. It's probably around 190, 195. You could use that for almost all of your teas except for your green teas. Those you should try to cool down a little bit. But if you're looking to improve your tea flavor, it's worth exploring ranges of temperature and just experimenting a little bit and see if you can get a better result. Same thing with time. So Japanese teas, they're the steamed ones. They have a very short brewing time for most of them, just anywhere from 45 seconds to 2 minutes. So really, really quick steep on those. Other types of green tea, generally 2 to 3 minutes. And for all the other types, 3 to 5. Again, keeping it simple. You could certainly do less and you can do multiple infusions. These are times for single infusion. So if you are re-steeping the time, which you definitely should be because that's part of the value of enjoying specialty tea, try reducing the time of that initial steep because that's what's going to help save a little bit so that you can re-steep it. But generally, like a good green tea should be able to be rebrewed 2 to 3 times at least. Oolongs and black teas are really designed for reinfusion. You'll may have some tea friends who sit down and reinfusing an oolong tea like 8 or 12 times. And basically what they're doing is brewing a stronger concentrate of that tea. So using a gaiwan or a very small little clay teapot and filling it with leaves and doing very short infusions from that concentrate. What we're looking at here for these brewing guidelines are a little bit more contemporary modern style brewing where it's slightly larger teapots and generally for a single infusion, but you can adjust it from there for sure. So that in mind, well, let's get into our tasting here. So like I said, we have 4 different teas that we're going to start with. We have a sencha. So this is a Japanese green tea. And then we also have a white tea. This is white peony, a very famous, well-known type of white tea. This one is Formosa Baihao. So this is from Taiwan. It's a darker style oolong tea. And this last one is a black tea from Fujian, China, which I really love this type of black tea because if you're a little bit new to black tea and you have a very specific idea of black tea, I'll taste like a certain type of tea bag. Teas from China and particularly from Fujian can be so eye-opening because they're smooth and savory and just really wonderful. So let's get started here first with putting our teapots out. So I really love for working in classes to use any type of glass teapot because it's very visual, and I definitely recommend it for beginners because there's something about having that close proximity to your tea when you're working with it that is really encouraging and really helps develop some confidence with working with the tea. When it's in an opaque ceramic teapot, it's hard to know really what's going on there. You can kind of peek open the lid and see if it looks done or not. But this gives you color, and you get to see the leaves open up, and you start to equate that visual with a certain taste. You start to, when you're tasting it, understand if that is to your liking or not. And you can see at what point, oh, you know, maybe I should have left it in there longer because this tastes a little bit light, and you associate the appearance of that tea with that taste. So it's very helpful from that perspective. These teapots are 400 milliliters, so just about 13 ounces of tea. And what's really cool is they have the strainer built into the lid. So you'll see several styles of teapot like this, which is really convenient. I recommend doing something that is as close to fully loose leaf brewing as you can get. So if you want to work with a type of teapot that has a strainer basket in it, that's great because you can just simply lift out the basket and it's very easy. But make sure it's really wide, like almost as if it can almost fill the entire inside of the teapot. That's really great, as opposed to something that's very narrow or a small, like little tea ball, because it doesn't allow the leaves to expand. So we really need to get the leaves to be able to expand and infuse with water, as well as to have good water flow through. Because if there's too much constriction, your tea can taste a little bit thin and it lacks some body. So again, something like this, or as close proximity as you can get, is great. If you don't have a teapot, honestly, you could just brew like super old style that they do in China, what they call grandpa or grandma style, which is just leaves in a glass and just drinking it from the glass. It's so awesome. The leaves will sink to the bottom, you know, over time, and it doesn't get over extracted that way because the top is open. There's no lid on it. So it's a great way to get to know your tea and explore different tea types. And at the very least, if you don't have teapots and all that other stuff, do not let that be a detail that overwhelms you or prevents you from exploring tea. Just get like a pint glass or something and put some leaves in it, and you can have a great time. Now, anytime you're working with a teapot that does not have a basket in it, just something to be aware. In other words, you cannot remove the leaves from it during the brew. You're going to need to be able to decant that tea into something. Now, that could be a mug. So since these teapots are somewhere around the size of a Western 14-ounce mug, I can decant this entire teapot into that mug and it will fill it. But if I wanted to use a smaller cup, like I have my little tasting cup here, if I fill this, it's still going to be substantially full with tea afterward. That means it's still brewing. So just be aware of matching your drinking ware to your brewing ware. So in which case you may want to use like a little pitcher. So there's a whole category of teaware just for this, which is awesome. These little sharing pitchers that are really just for that. They are for brewing tea, decanting it in here, and for sharing with guests, which is super cool. So if you don't have a mug big enough to hold the contents of that teapot, make sure you're decanting it into a pitcher. Otherwise, you're still going to keep brewing your tea in there, and it's going to get pretty bitter and pretty strong. So the next thing I want to do here is I need to measure my tea. I'm going to do this by weight. And I work with these teapots a lot, so I happen to know that for 400 milliliters, 6 grams is pretty good. So that's around the 1.5 grams, 2 gram ratio there. It's not quite 2 grams. If it were 2 grams, I'd be using 8. And that tastes a little bit strong for these types of teas and for this ratio of leaf. So 6 grams works really nicely here. So all I've done is just put my teapot here on this little small scale that I have. Again, $10 on Amazon. They're great. I have traveled all over the world with these for classes, and they do not break. They are very sturdy, so it can be super easy to maintain your consistency there. So I put on the scale, I zero it out, I make sure that it's reading grams, and then I'm just going to measure out 6 grams of leaf in here. And if you want to do this at home along with this class, you could use any types of tea that you have available to you. I like to use a range of ones from different categories, and I will explain how we're brewing them, because since they're different times at different temperatures, that could be a little technically kind of tricky to work with, so I'll walk you through it. But anytime that you're doing comparative tasting like that, make sure that you have multiples of of different teas. You know, doing tasting with just one type of tea is not as informative. Tasting groups, I like working with 3 to 4 teas at a time. That's really great for basic classes. Okay, so this white tea, I love working with this tea in classes because this really shows you so clearly why weight matters. Look how much leaf is in this compared to this sencha, which just barely covers the bottom of the cup. You know, so white tea can be one of the hardest to work with if you're trying to use a scoop. So the scoops may look something like this. This is a tablespoon scoop. I like working with this style because at least you have a chance that you can scoop the tea on there. You may need to use your thumb to sort of help guide it in there. But with something that's so light and fluffy, like a white tea, your scoop really needs to be like overflowing. It needs to be pretty obnoxious. So if you are scooping your tea, be really generous with it. If you're working with something that's a little bit more compact and dense, like this Fujian black tea, this is much smaller leaf pieces here. So you could, again, using your thumb to help out if you need. It's a nice like little level scoop there. It doesn't need to be super overflowing. And when you're scooping your tea, reason why I suggest using your thumb or something else to help you, you don't want to dig into it. If you're really like clawing your tea, you're just going to end up breaking it. And when you break up those pieces, they infuse differently. Some of the nuance of the flavor is lost because broken pieces mean there's quicker extraction in the water. So it's just going to taste a little bit sharper. And particularly if you broke it a lot. This is also why, if you've ever noticed, if you're already a loose leaf tea drinker, that the tea at the bottom of the container tastes different than the tea at the top, because typically there's a lot more broken pieces at the bottom, almost completely powdery. That's why. So you really want to try to be gentle with your tea and avoid breaking it. Got our nice oolong here, which is also another big fluffy tea. And finally, our black tea. Great. Also, when you're doing tastings, you may notice that I have, obviously these little tea trays out here. If you can have something that you put the dry leaf on for being able to look at it, that's also really great from an educational perspective. Because some of the things we'll do in classes is, for example, noticing like this white tea here, where we can make out the leaf buds. So that is a bud and a single leaf attached to it, which is really cool. It's nice to be able to see how the tea is actually put together here. You'll notice that with the white tea, there are longer stems and larger leaves, versus this black tea is very uniform and evenly sorted. There's some gold pieces and such in here, which I'll explain when we actually get to tasting it. So being able to have the tea on a tray displayed continues that understanding of the production style. When you're doing that, make sure that it's in a nice dry area. So I actually have this on a separate little tray in front here, so that we're keeping it separate, and you don't want to splash any water in there and ruin your tea sample or anything. If you can work with your tea on a board like this, that could be really helpful for brewing. It helps catch any spills and such. You're also going to need a timer. So I generally in the classes, I time for us. But if you're doing this at home on your own separately, or if your water's not ready right when we go or something like that, having a timer is really great. And finally, you also need water, of course, right? So I'm working with an electric kettle, a little gooseneck kettle that, in this case, this one does not have a temperature adjust, but I have a little thermometer in the spout here that is telling me what the temperature is at. Now, when we're working with teas that are different temperature ranges, it is easier to go up in temperature than it is to start with boiling and try to cool it down. That's really difficult. Years and years of doing classes on the road has taught me that. So I will save you the trouble of trying to, flounder around with trying to figure that out. So we start with the green tea water, and I will be adjusting it just a little bit to go up in scale, and it only takes a couple seconds. So I pour the first one, which is this sencha here. I hit start on my timer right when the water started going there, and I put the lid on right when I'm done pouring, just to keep the heat in. There we go. Put it back on the scale or the sensor over here and just heat it up a few more degrees. Now with the timer, what I'm doing is instead of timing for each tea individually, I just hit start and I'm letting it count up. And then as it approaches its time where it's done, so in this case, this tea for 2 minutes, I just kind of let it keep going. And I do the math between each one. So when I start the white tea, I make note of what time it is on the timer and when it should be done. So if I start the white tea when this timer is, say, at 1:30, then I know I need to add 1:30 to whatever time that is. It's a lot easier to do it that way than it is to have 4 different timers for things. And also because just setting the timer itself can be a bit awkward, and trying to figure out how to do that while you're pouring water at the same time is really, again, teaching a lot on the road, you definitely learn some things that are really hard, and timing your tea and talking at the same time is one of those things that can be very difficult. So our white tea is done. Add some water here. Now also notice with this, if it's a very fluffy tea, I'm kind of moving in a circular pattern, sort of showering the water on the leaves. It's because these float and they're really large and fluffy, and so you definitely want to make sure you're getting all the water on there that you can. So you need to do a little water refill. In all our classes, I always tell you how much water that you'll need in order to be able to brew your tea. So we have that set aside already. And let those go. We're at 2 minutes now on our green tea, so I'm going to go ahead and decant that guy. I'm kind of pulling back on the pot a little bit here to help make sure that all the water from the bottom is washing up over the leaves, and we're getting everything through here. Great. So one of the first things about this green tea you'll notice is, whoa, that color. So Japanese green teas, or basically teas that are steamed like that, tend to produce that really, really bright color. They also tend to be a little bit opaque. So compared to the white tea that's next to it, you'll notice that it's a little bit cloudy, it's a little bit brothy looking, and that's totally normal. That's what we want to see with this one. This oolong, since it's about the same oxidation as this black tea, it's not really all that different. I'm going to go ahead and brew it at the same temperature as this black tea, which is about 200. A little bit more water. There we go. Perfect. So our white tea will be done pretty quickly here. But so first of all, let's look at this, this Japanese green tea. So after these teas brew, they tend to be really sort of mushy, sort of spinachy looking. They open up pretty easily. So again, that's why the brew time is so quick on these teas. Now, after you brew the tea, before we even get to the tasting part, the next thing we want to do is really pay attention to the smell of the tea, the aroma of the infused leaf. As tea tasters, we make note of the aroma on the dry leaf as well, but you may find often that dry leaves don't have a super really noticeable aroma to them. You can help this process by, when you're smelling it, just sort of breathe in and out through your nose a few times, just breathing in the tea in a very relaxed way. That helps warm the surface a little bit and helps just give your brain a chance to adjust to smelling something like that. But it's a very faint aroma. This one smells pretty sweet, a little bit like a nice chlorophyll, fresh, toasty green quality to it. So the infused leaf definitely has quite a bit more aroma to it than the dry leaf. So as tasters, we spend a lot of time talking about the aroma of the infused leaf. So as each one of these is ready and we're decanting it, we'll be going in and exploring the aroma of each one. And when you do that, it's just really cracking the lid open a little bit, sticking your nose in there, And same sort of idea, just really breathing in the tea. So a lot of people describe Japanese teas as being very spinachy, very seaweed are some of the words that are used. Occasionally, sometimes people say fishy, which can sound odd, and usually there's some giggles when people do it, but I totally get what someone's saying. These teas, for one, they have a very sort of like oceany quality to them, which makes sense considering that they come from Japan, right? And so just the environment alone influences the tea a lot, the tea flavor. But they also, the way that they produce this tea, so remember we talked about different varieties of the tea plant, they tend to favor types that have higher amino acids that produce leaves that are very rich. When you make it into a green tea like this, it's brothy. It feels, it's quite savory actually. And so that makes sense. And that's some of what you're getting is kind of like a briny, salty, savory quality to it. It's not that it actually smells and tastes like sushi or something. And last one. So our oolong tea and our black tea, these things I just did both for 4 minutes. You could certainly go longer if you wanted, but 4 is really nice if you're not quite sure where to start. Our white tea I also did with 4. White tea tends to like a longer brew time. Contrary to, you may see a lot of recommendations that are a little bit dated that recommend brewing white teas with really cool water for start and a very short steep time. So these leaves are really quite different than the Japanese teas, right? So the Japanese teas are very soft. They're very fine and broken up because that's what the steaming does to it, right? They extract really quickly. We saw right away when we put the hot water on it that it's infusing, it's going. It makes this really rich color. White tea, on the other hand, though, most of the time is very large, very solid, sturdy leaf pieces, right? You've got whole leaf buds in here, which are very dense. And actually, if we look really closely, you'll see that some of the leaf buds are covered with these like little sort of like silvery fur on it, right? These little downy hairs. So white tea when, or springtime teas when they're growing, have these little hairs on them, sort of like if you've ever noticed sunflowers underneath the head of the flower, it's a little bit furry there. So these little hairs help protect the leaf bud when it's growing, helps protect it from the chill of the early spring and UV rays and also bugs. It sort of helps keep them from being able to penetrate through. And so this also is part of the reason why the tea floats and makes it a little bit more difficult to brew. It also produces a bit of a barrier for water to get through. So cooler water and a short steep wouldn't really make sense for these teas. The water will taste good. It'll taste like flavored water. It won't really taste like tea. It will lack some of the body and it will lack some of the fruity, really lush substance that we get from white tea normally. So that's why hotter water is really definitely a recommended point for white teas. How long you brew it is really up to you. So let's say by hotter water, I mean that this one was around 180 when we did it. So water temperatures for your reference. The green tea was 155 because it's a steamed green tea. The white tea was 180, and these were both 195, 200 because they're both relatively similar in oxidation. We'll get to that in a second. So white tea, if we're working around like 180 or so, the average brew time recommended is somewhere around 3 to 5 minutes or longer. White tea is really nice in that it doesn't really get bitter. So when you taste it, if it seems like it's just a little bit on the light side, put the tea back in the pot and keep going. I mean, it can take a good soak. It doesn't really get bitter. It's a sweet, really lovely, fresh tea. So be flexible with the brewing time on white tea. It's not as sensitive as green teas can be. Green teas, when they are overbrewed, tend to be very sharp and astringent and kind of medicinal tasting, which is, I think, sometimes what people associate with green tea if they've had bad experiences with it, is that it reminded them of medicine. And usually that's because it was overbrewed. Oolong tea is an amazing category because it's huge. It basically picks up where white tea leaves off in terms of oxidation. You know, we can see sort of the color difference here, right? So this white tea is starting to get some of the gold color to it, and this oolong tea is a richer gold color, more amber. So you'll see some oolong teas that are so light they almost look like green teas, and some that are so dark they almost look like black teas. This is an example of one, the Formosa Baihao, that is quite oxidized. And so it's really quite dark, and it does closely resemble a black tea, which is why I just decided to do these at the same time and temperature. So oolong tends to be a category that people get really passionate about and really geeky about. I'm one of them, because it's such a big category, and there's really a tea for everyone in this category. There's multiple seasons for enjoying that type of tea. You know, black tea can be hard to drink at some types of the year because it's you know, not only because it's brewed typically hotter, but it's a stronger, sturdier flavor profile. But oolong has such a variety. You may drink the greener, lighter, more fragrant ones at one time of year, and the ones that are deeper, richer flavor at another time of year. So it's a really, really awesome category. And black tea as well is a really great category, simply because there's so many origins that also produce tea. So again, like this idea that black tea is all just kind of your English breakfast, what's ever in a tea bag, is a real misunderstanding, because black tea can be an enormously great and creative category. There's a wide range of flavor profiles and different origins from black tea. And if you cut down the brewing temperature and the time just a little bit, even more so than this, you know, I did this 195 or so for 4 minutes. I could just as easily do 190, 185 for 2 minutes if I wanted, or even 1 minute. I mean, it produces a really very flavorful tea. So there's a lot of flexibility to play with black tea, which is wonderful. So we get into smelling these, back into smelling these. So the Japanese green, we were saying, is kind of seaweedy and oceany. Our white tea, by contrast, is, we start to notice some of the first notes of floral with this type of tea, floral and fruity. Some people say hay or wildflower. So there's something that's very outdoors and very springtime about it. And very fresh. So a nice white tea should definitely smell fresh. It shouldn't, when it's dried, it's a bit stale. Sometimes people say it's, you know, more like straw instead of fresh hay. So if it smells kind of, old tea smells just sort of a little dry, you know, and it's not like old tea. Old tea isn't bad for you. It won't do anything harmful, but it's certainly not very impressive. And it starts when you smell it. It doesn't have that same sort of enveloping you really warmth to it. It's just kind of dry and scratchy, and, you know, maybe smells a little bit dusty. Our oolong tea, which, by the way, look at how those leaves expanded. Like they really unfold quite a lot as they brew. So dark oolongs like this are really wonderful with their aromatic profile. They're a lot of times people describe it as kind of spicy, and not like hot chili spices, but warm cooking spices. So for me, this one always reminds me of when you're making filling for like a nice peach pie, and you put in a little like cinnamon or some spices in with it, or maybe some ginger. The combination of warm cooked peaches and spices is really, really spot on for this tea. People use all sorts of adjectives relating to stone fruits with this tea. So nectarines and peaches and plums, apricots. Really like some of the more dark, flavorful honeys. So oolong tea tends to be very, very aromatic. If you like tea that is very fruity and floral and really aromatic, then oolong tea is definitely a great category for you. Black tea here. Oh man. So a lot of black teas from Fujian, which is a coastal province in China. It's actually just across the water from Taiwan. Tend to have this wonderful, like, cocoa, savory, like bake shop aromas, you know, like you're going to go make some brownies or something. It's just like really sweet, very fresh. There's a slight earthiness to it, like fresh garden, but moreover, just like cocoa, tobacco, a little bit of black pepper, but not much. Really, really lovely. Absolutely just smells like a dessert tea. It's so awesome. Cool. So when we taste tea, we also tend to start with the lightest and work our way to the darkest. You can also go in any order, honestly, you want. I would suggest starting with lightest and working your way towards the heavier one, and then go back and kind of mix in, because sometimes you may not notice the contrast between two unless it's two very different ones opposing each other. And it can help bring out different flavors and qualities. So it's a worthy approach, but start at least with the lightest one first so that your palate isn't overwhelmed. Pour yourself just a little bit to get a nice taste, not a full cup, but a good mouthful there. And when we taste, we slurp, which if you've done coffee tasting or anything like that, you may be familiar with. The idea of slurping it helps you to be able to smell and taste the tea at the same time. So something like this. And when we're tasting, you don't want to swallow it really right away. Maybe just kind of chew on it a little bit. Just a pause to give your palate the chance to adjust to, oh, okay, it's tea. We're doing this now. And to make that connection in your head with some vocabulary. But slurping is really key. There's different explanations for why tasters slurp, and none of them are, the other ones are necessarily wrong, but they're not as direct. Sometimes you'll hear people say it oxygenates the tea. Yeah, sure. That it helps cool it down. That's definitely for sure, especially when you're talking about really hot teas like black tea when you brew them. But really what we're going at is this mechanism that you taste and you smell at the same time, because the way that we are built structurally is we can smell through our nose, and we can also smell through the back of our throat, through our nasal cavity. So when you are slurping, you're taking in air, and that helps you to be able to smell and to taste at the same time. And that's so important because our ability to smell is significantly stronger than our ability to taste. We can smell upwards of over 10,000 different odors compared to our ability to taste certain things. So most of actually what we're describing when we say this tastes like, or this reminds me of, actually comes down to aroma. So that's why we spend a lot of time smelling, and when we do taste, we are slurping at the same time to help emphasize that. So often what I like to do with a set of tea is just taste them all the way through first once to get a sense of what the table's like, things that are standing out, things I want to investigate further, rather than spending a lot of time on each one at a time and not comparatively to each other, because again, we're trying to compare and contrast here. So I'm just going to move to the next one. I encourage you to do the same if you're doing a tasting yourself. Just noting you, Sencha. I'll come back to you. So some things that you're noting, aside from just if flavors and aromas stand out, notice the tactile differences between them. By that, I mean like the body, the overall mouthfeel of it, if it's smooth, if it's juicy, if it's dry. That's some things like that we're noticing as we go. As well as the finish, which basically is a quality referring to after you have enjoyed the tea and the tea is no more, what is the impression that your palate is left like afterward. The finish of some teas can be what is called very lingering, meaning you are just kind of smelling and tasting it for a long time after you've had it. Others can be very brief. They're sort of there and gone. Some, the finish can almost bridge a little bit more towards some tactile impressions. So maybe it leaves your mouth a bit dry, or it's sort of like a sweet finish. But that's also an important part of noting what the impression of the tea is. Awesome set. So honestly, one of my fun, like my favorite tastings to do is any version of a green to black set, because there's so many stories that are woven into a set like this as far as how teas relate to each other, where they came from, their different processing styles. things that are similar in one that are similar to another for a completely different reason than what may be obvious. So it's helpful to do sets like this in different formations with different teas. So with our sencha here, some of the flavors that we're getting, a lot of that seaweed character comes through in terms of it tastes really spinachy. It tastes very green, you know, very, at class recently, somebody was saying very planty, which I thought was kind of cool. It definitely tastes like fresh cooked greens. The mouthfeel is really what's most impressive with a lot of Japanese teas. That's where you're getting that amino acid, savory, rounded, brothy quality, which is so cool. There's a creaminess to it, which is really nice. So a green tea, regardless of whether it's Japanese tea or like a classical Chinese green or anything like that, what you don't want to have is bitterness, astringency, which is a similar component of tea. It often gets confused with bitterness. Bitterness is a flavor. Astringency is a texture. So astringency is what you're noticing anytime that you get like a dry, crisp sensation on the side of your palate, kind of like your cheeks and your gums. And in some teas, you know, for the most part, you want some astringency, right? There are very few teas where having no astringency is interesting. It's sort of like a soda that has no carbonation. It's kind of boring. So you want some astringency, but you don't want it to be overly astringent to the point where it just dries out your palate entirely and it's not enjoyable. So green teas have a very crisp and sort of like gentle astringency to them, but they should not be overbearing. So we want to avoid bitterness. We want to avoid over astringency with our green teas. Anything that kind of pushes it to where it's more medicinal, kind of metallic or bitter tasting, we want to avoid that. And we can avoid that through being careful of how much water and the temperature of the water and the amount of time that we're using with that type of tea. The lovely white tea here. So the first thing that stands out to me with this tea is it has a completely different mouthfeel. Whereas the sencha is very creamy and very brothy, this white tea is just as crisp and clear and refreshing as like a nice, like a white grape juice. You know, it's really juicy. It's watery, but not in a way that's implying that it's weak or under brewed, but it's watery and that it's refreshing like water is. So that clarity, that juiciness is just wonderful. It has a very low astringency. You know, if it has any at all, it's kind of more reminiscent of when you bite into a pear, you know, and a pear has just a little bit of some of that like juicy kind of crisp astringency, but it's very smooth compared to like, say, a Granny Smith apple, which is very high in that astringency and that acidity quality. It's very sweet. So white tea tends to, for people who have a sweet tooth, it tends to be a really appealing tea. Because it's naturally very sweet, kind of has a nice honey quality to it. It's a little floral, but not overly floral. So if you're not a fan of big florals in your foods and in your teas, white tea can be really nice because it's more honey than it is floral. It's certainly not the quality of like somebody spraying perfume in your mouth or something like that. Yum. Oolong. So darker oolongs particularly get very rich. So this is where, like, say, white tea and lighter oolongs are more like fresh fruit and fresh florals. Like I took the nectarine just off the tree and it's a nice fresh bite of it or whatever. Darker oolongs tend to get more into like cooked fruit and dried florals and really deep, very nuanced layers to it. So it's absolutely delicious. The peachy quality that was coming through on the aroma definitely is in the cup. It's also a lower astringency too. So it's just very gentle. It's not a super dry tea, more juicy than it is anything else, but very smooth, which is another wonderful quality about quite a lot of oolongs. It's just the smoothness of the mouthfeel there. And they also tend to have a very long, very lingering finish, which is another enjoyable part of them. You know, it's part of the value of a good oolong tea is that finish that you're just sort of smelling and tasting it for hours after you've had it. It's supremely relaxing because of that. It's just really, really lovely tea. Great for multiple infusions as well. finally, our black tea. Oh, it's so sweet. It's so like cocoa-y, and it reminds me like a little bit of like a dark brownie batter, you know, like it's a little bittersweet, but that cocoa-y, that fudgy quality to it, it's so smooth. A little malty, which is a big word in describing particularly darker black teas like this, is malty. So malted grains, roasted grains, things like that. If you haven't had the chance to, say, visit a brewery and do a grain tasting of the different types of malts that they do, an apt comparison would be like a brown bread. If you've ever had like a really dark brown bread, this is very similar to that, sort of like rich, dark grains. But the smoothness is what makes it so enjoyable, because sometimes malty teas can be really pungent and very, good in the taste buds and super strong. But the smoothness of this and that cocoa quality really makes it so it's so much more of a luxurious experience. You can really just sip that tea and get into it and enjoy it. It's just wonderful. Oh, so good. So I'm going to head back to our presentation here for just a second. So we're talking then about what comes next. The more often that you can do tastings like this in a comparative format, like I said, 3 to 4 teas at a time, really helps open up your learning and your understanding of tea. So try doing this. It doesn't always have to be like a green to black tasting. It could be different versions of that. Maybe it could be, 3 different oolongs or 3 different black teas, or it could be a darker oolong and 2 darker black teas to understand that difference of oxidation. Maybe you want to explore different types of white teas, or compare greener oolongs to green teas and see what's similar and see what's different. But tasting tea is fundamentally different than drinking tea. Drinking tea is just, purely for your own enjoyment, sitting down, often just drinking one tea at a time, or you're with friends and everyone's just sharing multiple teas. So that's a drinking tea. But when we're talking about tasting, we're talking about something that's comparative. And so by its nature, you need to have multiples of something. So try to find a setup and a space that you could taste multiple teas at a time and be able to choose topics for that tasting that help broaden your understanding of tea. And there's no wrong topic. There's any number of ways that we can create tastings like this. And so doing that is some of the work that we'll do in classes together, if you're on the online program, of how you structure a really great comparative tasting. Because that's honestly, when people are asking how they can learn more about tea and what types of books they can read and such, all of that is helpful. All of the, there's a number of resources that are very academic in structure for learning about tea. Nothing replaces the experience of what you'll learn at the tasting table. There's no shortcut to that. And nor should you want one, actually, because it's some of the truly most enjoyable work of being part of tea and working in the tea industry or being a tea enthusiast is the tasting. It's the best part. So that's really where you do all that heavy lifting and all that learning. And we focus a lot on tasting and brewing tea in these classes. So I want to explain a little bit about how this works for you guys in case you're interested. But first of all, just thank you for attending this Welcome to Tea session. If you enjoyed this class, I do kindly accept donations for the production of this class. But otherwise, you can find me on Patreon, which is the platform where I host ongoing classes. Is for a monthly subscription. So patreon.com/beingtea. My format is live classes, like I explained, but there are recordings available for everything, so no pressure at all if you miss one for schedule or anything like that. It is a monthly subscription, so it's not pay per class. It's a flat fee each month, and you have your choices of whatever classes are on the schedule for that month that you can participate in. It does tend to be more seasonal, so rather than kind of running through a repeating schedule of beginner to advanced each time, I'm doing seasonal classes each month that run from beginner to advanced. So for example, in the summertime, there's basics of cold brew and iced tea, things like that. There's a level for just functional basics of tea, as well as for professional skills. There's also tea meditation study, because part of my research is also into tea, that how it supports our physical and our mental well-being. So I teach tea meditation, and we do this in both basic form, where it's just your ongoing practice, as well as a deeper study of understanding the psychosomatic connections of how tea physically and mentally supports us and helps increase our well-being. And I also offer private tutoring. So we can work one-on-one together, or I can do small group classes for you, whether it's for like a private club or a business that you have. And all my memberships start at just $5 to $10 a month and go up from there. And you can change at any time, any level that you want. You can explore one topic and switch to another. It's very, very flexible, very meant to be interactive. So anytime you have questions, you can always email me. You can also, if you are unable to attend a class in person, but you have a question about that particular topic and you'd like to see it addressed in class, you can email me in advance and just let me know. But otherwise, thank you guys so much for attending here. And I hope you really enjoyed the class. And I definitely hope to see you online soon. Take care.